Jesus Christ. He needs no introduction. He is the founder of the world's largest religion. But what did he look like? I'm sure we're all familiar with this image of Christ. But by this point, we should all know that it's wrong. So what did he look like? Well, Christ lived in the Middle East around the 1st century AD, specifically in the Roman province of Judea. So was Christ this ruggedy, apparently Jewish-looking man, or was he a majestic black man? Well, this image of Christ, created I think around the year 2001, supported by scientists, archaeologists, and the general population. But I think they're all wrong. I'll explain why later. So is this image of Christ correct? Well, no. I don't think this image is correct either. I'll explain which image I think is correct later on in the video. But what does the Bible say? Well, it really doesn't say anything about his appearance. Well, actually that's a lie. It does say in Revelations chapter 1, verse 14 and 15 that the hairs of his head were white like wool, and that his skin is like burnished bronze. And the image on the left is a recreation of this description. In Isaiah, it says that he had no beauty nor majesty, meaning he was just a regular looking guy. He also escaped into Egypt at one point and blended into the population, so he must have looked Egyptian. Jesus was also a carpenter, which is very hard work today and especially back then, meaning he was probably very muscular and also not very tall because the people during that time were not very tall. Well, Jesus was an Israelite, or a Jew, but what did they look like? That's a question I'm here to answer. Jewish people or Israelites are an Afro-Asiatic people, including all these people you see on the screen. Yes, this includes Arabs and Berbers, but it also includes Ethiopians, Somalians, and the Beja people. Well, in the Bible itself, it says various times that the Israelites look like Egyptians. And there's also many outside sources that also affirm this. But what about the Egyptians? So if the Israelites looked like the Egyptians, or whatever the race the Egyptians were, the Israelites were also that race. Well, were the Egyptians black or Middle Eastern? I think they were black, but not in the same sense that you would think of today. Let me explain. One argument that people use to say that the Egyptians couldn't have been black is that the Nubians depict themselves as jet black versus the Egyptians who depict themselves using a dark reddish brown. I think this is wrong, but I'll explain later. For some added context, Egypt is, yes, on the continent of Africa, but on the very northeastern corner. In Egyptian art, you can see Egyptians depict themselves with fuller lips and smaller noses. You can also see that they depict themselves with what appears to be Afro-textured, tightly coiled hair. Here is an Egyptian race diagram. As you can see, Egyptians depicted themselves much darker than Asiatics and Libyans, other Afro-Asiatic peoples. But they depicted themselves lighter than Nubians, but showed themselves with the same type of hair. Now, I'm going to go on a whim here and say I don't think the Nubians and Egyptians looked very different from one another. For starters, most Nubians weren't literally jet black, and they didn't even depict themselves as that most of the time. A lot of the time they depicted themselves with more, the same kind of skin tone as the Egyptians, or sometimes jet black, as you can see in this picture. And also, I think they depict themselves differently for more cultural reasons to distinguish themselves, rather than a literal genetic reason. The Egyptians weren't above doing this. As you can see, they depicted women with light yellowish colors most of the time, and men with dark reddish brown color, even though they literally didn't look that different. They were literally the same race. And also, just a side thing, a tan cannot change your skin tone that much. So for a little more context, the Nubians come from Proto-Nilotic people who came out of what is now South Sudan and migrated north and becoming the Nubians. I believe that they probably went further north and also became the Egyptians, or the ancestors of the Egyptians. Later on, Afro-Asiatic migrants came in and mixed with the Egyptians, but they still would have remained pretty black. So Egypt, for all of its history, was divided between Upper and Lower Egypt culturally, but even if it was one country. So in Upper Egypt, you would have seen much darker features, whereas in Lower Egypt, you would have seen lighter features to reflect migrations from other regions in the Middle East and Europe. Still don't believe me? Well, you don't have to listen to me. Listen to Herodotus. The Kalenjians are Egyptian, because like them they are black-skinned and have woolly hair. Aristotle. Those who are too black are cowards, as for example the Egyptians and Ethiopians. Wow, Aristotle. Kinda racist, but my point still stands. Diodorus. The Ethiopians say that the Egyptians are one of their colonies, which was brought into Egypt by Orderus. They say this is why the Egyptians are black-skinned and have woolly hair, and are more ancient than other men. Tacitus. Many assert that Jews are an Ethiopian race. Ooh, I don't even know how to say that name, but he's very important. The Jews are dark in body, and noble in soul, rejected by the Lord. Al-Jahiz. The people of the south, including the Egyptians, are black because of the sun. Ibn Akhamat describes the Egyptians of brown to dark complexion, often depending on the region. Upper Egypt, darker than lower. This was way later, by the way, like I think the 1400s. Still not convinced? Well, let me introduce you to Egyptian wooden statues. They're not very common, but they're probably the most accurate depictions of what the average Egyptians would have looked like. And do I even need to say anything? These clearly show Afro-textured hair, or at least tightly coiled hair, darker skin, and African features. So were the Israelites black? Well, yes. By this point, you should know that the Egyptians were black. Not in the same sense that, black Americans or other Africans we know today are, but still were black. And if the Egyptians and Israelites looked very similar, this also means the Israelites were black. So yes. By this point, you should know that a white Jesus with long hair is simply foolish. But you should also know that this ruggedy Arabian-looking Jesus is just as foolish. But this majestic black Jesus with long dreadlocks can't be how he looked, for various reasons, including one being that long hair was not customary for Jewish men. So what did he look like? Well, I used AI to create an image that I think is the most accurate one. And here it is. I'm not saying that this is definitely how Christ looked, but I think that this is most likely how he looked. As you can see, a black man, but with a lot of Middle Eastern admixture, short hair, regular looking, and a little more built. This is how I think Jesus looked like. Now I hear you asking, does any of this really matter? Well, yes and no. Yes, because I think it's important to get the appearance of Christ right, and I think it's important to show that African people had a far larger impact in history rather than just being confined to sub-Saharan Africa and just, being beneficiaries of technology imported from Mesopotamia. But it's also not very important because ultimately what's more important is spreading the gospel and helping people find salvation through Christ. So I see this as more of just a fun hobby of mine to show people the truth. But ultimately, spreading the gospel is a far greater truth. And I want to, hopefully, in my missions, help black and white people come to the conclusion and unite them through Christ.